In Moscow, under the grand ceilings of the Russian Foreign Ministry's reception halls, a ceremony unfolded that may seem, at first glance, ceremonial and minor, but in fact, it carries implications far beyond the ornate chamber where the documents were signed. Nicaragua, a Central American nation led by President Daniel Ortega's authoritarian government, formally signed cooperation agreements with leaders of Russian-controlled regions in Ukraine. The event was presided over by Russia's veteran Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, a figure who has become synonymous with Moscow's diplomatic resilience. Across the table sat Laureano Ortega Murillo, the son of Nicaragua's president and his special envoy for cooperation with Russia. For observers, Laureano's presence is no coincidence. He is increasingly the public face of Nicaragua's foreign policy realignment, tasked with forging deep ties with Moscow and Beijing at a time when Managua faces mounting isolation from Western capitals. One by one, Ortega shook hands with Moscow-installed leaders from Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, Denis Pushilin, Leonid Pasechnik, Yevgeny Belitsky, and Vladimir Saldo. To the Kremlin, each handshake was a symbolic confirmation that Russia's occupation has found at least some echo of international acceptance. To Kyiv and much of the international community, however, these gestures represent a dangerous precedent. A foreign government treating proxy authorities born of invasion and annexation as legitimate partners. The backdrop matters. The agreements were signed inside Morozova's mansion, a reception house long used by the Russian Foreign Ministry to project elegance and continuity. Lavrov's presence ensured the ceremony was not just bureaucratic paperwork, but a diplomatic statement, a claim that Russia's war in Ukraine has not left it in total isolation. For Nicaragua, the decision to sign these agreements reflects both ideology and necessity. Since the 1980s, when the Sandinista revolution first clashed with US policy in Central America, the Ortega family has positioned itself as part of an anti-imperialist axis. Over the decades, as relations with Washington soured, Managua turned more and more toward Russia for military supplies, economic assistance, and political backing. Today, with Daniel Ortega entrenched in power and his son Laureano operating as chief envoy, Nicaragua has emerged as one of Moscow's loudest defenders in Latin America. This alignment is not accidental. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has spent years cultivating ties with governments that share a hostility to the West. Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua have all featured prominently in Moscow's outreach. By signing agreements with Russia's proxies in Ukraine, Nicaragua signals that it is willing to go further than most, risking international criticism in order to demonstrate loyalty to Moscow. The timing of the ceremony is also telling. In late 2025, as Russia digs in across occupied territories of Ukraine, the Kremlin is increasingly focused on breaking the Western narrative of diplomatic isolation. Every handshake, every foreign delegation that enters Moscow's orbit becomes an opportunity to show that the global South is not united behind sanctions or condemnation. For Lavrov, this signing ceremony provided exactly that, proof that at least one sovereign state is willing to formalize relations with Moscow's newly claimed territories. But beyond symbolism, what do these cooperation agreements actually mean? Official statements are deliberately vague, promising joint projects, economic exchange, cultural ties. Yet behind the words lies the political essence. By signing, Nicaragua acknowledges these entities as partners rather than occupied regions. That recognition, however limited, chips away at the Western argument that Russia stands entirely alone in its annexation campaign. In Ukraine, the reaction has been scathing. Officials in Kyiv condemned the agreements as illegitimate and dangerous, accusing Nicaragua of endorsing war crimes and occupation. Western governments, too, have voiced concern. For Washington, Nicaragua's deepening ties with Moscow come at a moment of heightened tension in the Americas, where Russia and China are both accused of expanding their influence. For Brussels, the agreements highlight the challenge of sustaining a united international front when some governments openly break ranks. Inside Nicaragua, the Ortega regime has justified its stance as one of sovereignty and anti-imperialism. Laureano Ortega has repeatedly argued that Managua's partnership with Moscow offers economic and technological benefits. Yet critics, both inside the country and abroad, argue that the deals primarily serve the political survival of the Ortega family, exchanging international legitimacy from Russia in return for diplomatic recognition of Russian conquests. The ceremony also draws attention to the individual figures representing the Russian-controlled territories. Denis Pushilin of Donetsk and Leonid Pasechnik of Luhansk have long been fixtures of Moscow's proxy governance in eastern Ukraine, dating back to the conflict that began in 2014. Yevgeny Belitsky of Zaporizhzhia and Vladimir Saldo of Kherson, meanwhile, represent newer chapters of Russia's occupation, installed after the 2022 full-scale invasion. All four are sanctioned by Western governments, accused of collaborating in illegal annexations and enabling repression. Yet in Moscow's reception hall, they were treated as statesmen, receiving recognition that is denied to them almost everywhere else. For Russia, this moment plays into a broader strategy, the creation of parallel international legitimacy. While most of the world recognizes Ukraine's territorial integrity, Moscow seeks to craft its own network of recognition, however small. In 2008, after the war in Georgia, Russia secured recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia from only a handful of states, including Nicaragua. Today, Moscow appears to be following the same script, presenting Nicaragua once again as an early and loyal partner in legitimizing disputed territories. The implications go beyond Europe. In Latin America, the Ortega regime's actions deepen divisions. Some governments, like those of Venezuela and Cuba, may applaud or quietly support the move. Others, including democracies that have condemned Russia's invasion, are likely to view Managua's actions as reckless and destabilizing. For Washington, it fuels concerns that Russia is building a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, not only through military cooperation, but also through political recognition. The visual power of the images cannot be overstated. Laureano Ortega, smiling as he shakes hands with Denis Pushilin, Leonid Pasechnik, Yevgeny Belitsky, and Vladimir Saldo. Sergei Lavrov, presiding with his usual calm, signaling that Moscow views this as a diplomatic win. The ornate mansion captured by AFP's cameras, reinforcing the sense of ceremony and permanence. These pictures will circulate widely on Russian state media, in Nicaraguan broadcasts, and across international news wires. Each image carries its own message depending on the audience: legitimacy for Moscow, defiance for Managua, outrage for Kyiv, and unease for Washington. Yet beneath the formality, the agreements raise fundamental questions. What is the cost of recognition? When a government like Nicaragua signs documents with Moscow's proxies, does it advance its own sovereignty, or does it become a pawn in a wider geopolitical contest? For the people of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, many of whom continue to live under shelling, repression, and displacement, these ceremonies can feel distant, even surreal. While leaders shake hands in Moscow, ordinary civilians face the daily reality of war. The United Nations, for its part, continues to insist on Ukraine's territorial integrity, rejecting any agreements that attempt to alter borders by force. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned that international recognition of such annexations risks undermining the global order itself, setting precedents that could echo in conflicts far beyond Eastern Europe. As the ceremony concluded, Denis Pushilin and Yevgeny Belitsky were seen leaving the hall, documents signed, cameras flashing. For them and for Moscow, the goal had been achieved. Another piece of paper, another photo opportunity, another step toward presenting Russia's occupation as a fait accompli. For Nicaragua, the cost is harder to measure. Its place in Western diplomacy is further eroded, its reputation tied even more closely to Moscow's. Yet for the Ortega family, the calculation may be simple. In a world of sanctions and isolation, loyalty to Russia guarantees protection, investment, and political backing. And so, in a mansion in Moscow, a small but symbolically charged ceremony has reminded the world that the war in Ukraine is not only fought with tanks and artillery, but also with signatures and handshakes. In this battle for legitimacy, even distant actors like Nicaragua have become players, reshaping the global map of recognition, one agreement at a time.